Hello everybody and welcome to today's video, a plot summary of Dennis Kelly's play DNA. It can be quite tricky to work out exactly what's happening in this play. There are 11 different characters and often one will say something that doesn't make sense until later on. So in today's video I'll give a simple summary. All of the characters who appear on stage are secondary school students. In my interview with Dennis Kelly, he said he's always thought of these characters as being about 12 or 13 years of age. Act 1. Scene 1 takes place in a street. The characters involved are Jan and Mark. In the play's opening scene, Jan and Mark discuss how someone is dead. We later learn that they're talking about Adam. Scene 2 takes place in a field. The characters involved are Leah and Phil initially. Jan and Mark arrive near the end of the scene. Leah questions Phil over what he's thinking about. Phil remains silent throughout, eating an ice cream. Jan and Mark enter. Mark says they have something to tell Leah and Phil. Scene 3 takes place in a wood. The characters involved are initially Lou, John Tate and Danny. A little bit later Richard, Kathy and Brian enter, and a little bit later Mark, Jan, Leah and Phil enter. Lou is panicked. John Tate tells her everything will be fine. Danny is anxious that his future plans to become a dentist will be ruined by what has happened. John Tate threatens to bite the face of anyone who uses the word dead. Kathy is excited by what has taken place. Mark explains what happened to Adam. The group made him eat leaves, burn his socks and steal vodka. They punched him repeatedly in the face, stubbed out cigarettes on him and made him run across the motorway. At that point, Jan went home. The group took Adam to a deep shaft with a metal grill over it. They made Adam walk across it, then threw stones at him until he fell into the shaft and presumably died. John Tate asks Leah and Phil what they should do. Phil comes up with a plan to cover up the crime. He suggests that Kathy, Danny and Mark break into Adam's house, take an item of clothing, plant a random man's DNA on the clothing by making him touch the clothes, and throw it in a hedge. Phil instructs Richard to take Brian to the school headmaster. Brian is to cry and explain that a man wearing a postman's uniform exposed himself to him in the woods. Phil invents a description of the postman: fat, sad eyes, softly spoken, bad teeth. Phil tells Danny to walk into the woods with Jan on his back, whilst Lou does the same on her own. This part of the plan is aimed at leaving footprints which would seem to show an overweight adult has been in the woods with Adam. A couple of days after Adam's been reported missing, John Tate is to explain that he saw Adam with a postman in the area. Phil's plan is that the authorities will believe Adam was abducted by the postman, and so the children themselves will not get into trouble. Scene 4 takes place in a field. The characters involved are Leah and Phil. Leah talks to Phil about how bonobos are our nearest relative. Phil remains silent throughout, eating a bag of crisps. Act 2, Scene 1 takes place in a street. The characters are Jan and Mark. Jan and Mark discuss how someone is not going. We later learn they're talking about Brian, who is refusing to go to the police station. Scene 2 takes place in a field. The characters are Leah and Phil initially. Jan and Mark enter at the end. Leah questions Phil over whether he's happy. Phil remains silent throughout, eating a pack of Starburst. Leah explains that she killed her pet, Jerry. She has Jerry in a container and shows it to Phil. Phil shrugs. Leah explains that since following Phil's plan, everything's much better. Dan and Kathy are friends. Richard invited Mark to a party. However, John Tate has lost it. Jan and Mark enter. Jan says, "We need to talk." Scene 3 takes place in a wood. The characters are Phil and Leah, Lou and Danny, and then Richard and Kathy enter midway through. Danny explains that an actual postman matching the description of the one invented by Phil has been found and is being questioned in connection with Adam's disappearance. The police want Brian to go to the police station to see if the man is the same one who exposed himself in the woods. Richard and Kathy have come from the police station. Lou believes the postman will be sent to prison. Leah argues that just because a man was found matching the physical description given by them, it wouldn't be enough to send him to prison. Leah explains that the police would need DNA evidence linking the man to Adam if he was to be connected to the disappearance. Richard says that the police have DNA evidence. Kathy explains that when she planted DNA evidence on Adam's jumper, she found a man who matched the fat, balding postman with bad teeth description invented by Phil and planted his DNA on Adam's jumper. Brian doesn't want to go to the police station to identify the man. Phil threatens to murder him if he doesn't do so, and Brian agrees to go. Scene 4 takes place in a field. The characters are Leah and Phil. Leah talks to Phil about reality. Phil only says one word throughout, but mostly focuses on buttering a waffle. Act 3, Scene 1 takes place in the street. The characters are Jan and Mark. Mark tells Jan that Kathy found someone in the woods. We later learn that the person who has been found is none other than Adam. Scene 2 takes place in a field. The characters are Leah and Phil initially, and Jan and Mark enter at the end. Leah tells Phil she is leaving. Phil remains silent throughout. Leah explains that there was a memorial service for Adam and that everyone's happy, although Brian is on medication and John Tate hasn't been seen in weeks. Also, the postman falsely accused of abducting Adam is facing the rest of his life in prison. Jan and Mark arrive, telling Leah and Phil they should go with them. Scene 3 takes place in a wood. The characters involved are Kathy, Brian, Phil, Leah, Mark, Lou and Jan, and Adam. Adam has been found suffering from a head injury. He's been living in a hedge and eating insects, grass, leaves. Phil tells Mark, Jan and Lou to leave. Phil tells Kathy to kill Adam, suffocating him with a bag around his head. Leah tells him not to do it, but Phil ignores her. Scene 4 takes place in a field. The characters are Leah and Phil. Leah leaves Phil. Phil calls after her, but Leah is silent throughout. Act 4, Scene 1 takes place in a street. The characters are Jan and Mark. Mark tells Jan that someone has gone, and we later learn the person they're referring to is Leah, who has possibly moved schools. Scene 2 takes place in a field. The characters are Richard and Phil. Phil has left the group and spends his days alone in the field. Richard tries to persuade him to rejoin it, and Richard explains that John Tate has found God, Danny is doing work experience at a dentist's, Brian's on stronger and stronger medication, Kathy's now in charge of the group, and Jan and Mark have taken up shoplifting.